The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. By the standard expressed by Dr. Cornel West, an activist and philosopher, there is limited evidence of love in our society today. It's difficult to pass a day without hearing of hate crimes perpetrated against Black Americans, Asian Americans, refugees from Latin America, and indigenous peoples. Replacing hate with love and injustice with justice is a mission that must begin in the home, according to our guest in today's episode of Challenge 2.0, Social Justice Parenting. Our guest today is Dr. Tracy Baxley, the author of Social Justice Parenting. A professor of education, she has spent 3 decades teaching the value and practice of diversity and inclusion. It's a result of her academic training, and as I suspect she'll tell us also, it's also the result of her experience raising 5 children. Dr. Baxley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you with us. This has been just a marvelous read with so much information, and I know we can't cover all that we'd like to in this program, but let's begin with, if we can, a personal story. You share in your book the story of a school morning when you couldn't find one of your children. What happened to make that so worrisome?
Yes, that was one of the opening stories. It really was I would say the premise of how social justice parenting really began. My oldest son at the time was maybe like 12 years old and had just been diagnosed with really high anxiety, and his ways of thinking weren't always very rational. And he would take something that seemed small and ordinary, and it would, in his mind, would expand to something pretty large and kind of out of control. So he was diagnosed with anxiety and OCD. And so it was a morning that he had forgotten to do his homework, and which should have been just a normal behavior. He panicked, and I couldn't find him when it was time to leave for school. And I was running through the house trying to find him, and I couldn't find him. And, this paralyzing fear kind of went over me. It was post Trayvon Martin, all the things, my neighborhood is a predominantly white neighborhood, and all those things as a Black mother started rushing through my head with my child, who I knew wasn't thinking rationally what could happen to him, and if I had taught him the things I needed to teach him to stay safe. So all of that really was the beginning of me thinking it's way more than me keeping my own kids safe. It's about how do we as parents create, raise children in a way that we can keep each other's children safe, and be accountable for the way we're raising our children, so that all children feel a sense of belonging and a sense of safety.
And we should circle back just for a moment. It turned out that your son was fine, correct?
Yes, he was. He was actually using the tools that he had been learning in therapy really to get himself to a place where he can calm down. So it turned out to be a really great story in the end.
And as you said, that led to your writing of this book. You outline the concept of a social justice home. Could you unpack that for us a little bit? Tell us exactly what that means. And I think you use an acronym. Is it called ROCKS? ROCKS principles?
Yes. So social justice homes are really homes that are really grounded in the lives, the interests, and the experiences of the members in your home. So you really have to get to know your kids for who they are, not necessarily what you want them to be, in order to really create this idea of a pro-justice and empathetic household, which is this idea of consistently encouraging, courageous acts and thinking about others with your actions. And it also requires us as adults to really lead that and to show our kids how to be more accountable in their actions. And so the rocks is really kind of the building blocks of social justice parenting. And it's a way that the actions behind creating social justice homes. So the rocks stand for reflection, open dialogue, compassion, kindness, and social engagement. So how do we start to believe those principles for ourselves, right? How do we model those for our kids? And then how do we teach our children to show up in the world
Mhm.
using those same principles? Right now, my kids are between the ages of 12 and 21. So they're a little bit older now, but there have been a lot of examples that as I sit back as a mom, sometimes when we're in the middle of parenting, we don't think anything is working.
Mhm.
But I think this idea of consistently showing up the same way, right, in ways that you want your kids to learn your values and show up in the world is really important. And so there's been a few examples, and I mentioned them in the book that I am able to kind of be an observer of in my kids that make me really proud that some of the things that we're teaching in terms of social justice parenting and social justice household really are coming to fruition. One particular instance, I remember my third child, which is my second son, had found $20 at a park. And we went around asking anybody whose money it was. Nobody claimed it. So I'm like, you can keep it. And he was just so elated about having this $20. He must have been 7 or 8 at the time. And then we left the park with our friends and we went to the grocery store. And in the parking lot of the grocery store, there was an immigrant family there holding a sign asking basically for money to help pay their rent.
Mhm.
And as excited as he was about finding that $20, he was even more excited about giving that $20 to the family. And
Wow.
I was just so proud in that moment that his compassion overwhelmed his feelings of, selfishness in a way, because he wasn't asked to give the money to them, but he really felt that that was the right thing to do, was very excited about it. So it's in those moments that I realized all the things we pour into our children, it comes out one way or another.
As a parent myself, when you get that affirmation, especially if you happen to be present, that is so powerful and makes you feel so very good. Tracy, we often hear parents say that their goal is to raise a good person. Is it enough to raise a good person, or what is the difference between what people might conceive of as a good person, as opposed to someone like with your children that have been raised in a household that focuses on social justice parenting practices?
That's a really great question. I love that question because there's nothing wrong with raising good children, right? We all want to raise kids and teach our children to be kind to others. But I also think that raising good children is almost like a safe way, right?
Mhm.
And it could really align with some of our own fears as parents, right? I'm raising a good child, and that's good enough. But I think we really need to be thinking about how we go a little bit deeper in our parenting. And that is moving from raising good children to really raising children who are pro-justice. And
Mhm.
the difference between the two is really this teaching kids to be activists or to have an action behind what they're doing. So I think, like in a nutshell, raising good children is teaching our kids to do no harm, but
Mhm.
raising pro-justice children is really raising our children to intercede when harm is being done. So these are the kids that would be adults being the allies or the activists or the anti-racist because they've been taught, as a habit that their job or they're capable of changing the world around them. And
Mhm.
so as I'm raising kids in my home, I really want to make sure I'm raising kids who are beyond good children, but really raising kids who are going to be proactive and change the things that are wrong, really, that are not working in our country right now.
You made the point in your book that parenting is inherently a form of activism. What exactly do you mean by that? And what is that? We get a sense of that from what you've discussed so far, but maybe you can explain that a little bit further.
Yeah, I really think that what happens and what is taught in the private spaces of our homes, they're going to show up in the public places in society. So we as parents should be more conscious about what we're pouring in. And that includes what we're saying and doing or what we're not saying and doing, right? Those send powerful messages as well. So I think activism can really take place in the quiet spaces of your children's bedrooms, based on teaching them self-love, self-advocacy, reading books that talk about others, that normalizes being different. Those things are
Mhm.
really important that they'll take out into the world and they'll have those same values in the way that they navigate around other people.
Mhm. When you just mentioned normalizing being different and creating space for that, it reminds me of a story you told. I think the young man's name was Ruben in one of your classrooms. Can you share that as an example for us?
Yes, that really goes to this idea of raising children who create belonging, right? Who create spaces for belonging in the world. Ruben was a student in my very first classroom, my kindergarten classroom, and I was told that the class was difficult because I started in the middle of the school year.
Mhm.
And I didn't know what that really meant because it was my first year of teaching. But it turns out that he was a child that really was considered an alcohol fetal baby.
Mhm.
And his mom was on and off drugs while she was pregnant with him. And he had a hard time really kind of controlling his emotions and his body, which back in the day we call him a runner. He would just take off running, screaming, because I think his body was really in pain. You know, he was going through withdrawals. And he was a child who was behind academically in school. And I really didn't know how to control a lot of the things, but I
Mhm.
knew how to love on him. And so I just used that thing that I call radical love to just love on him every day. And with that, he began to really open up about what his body was feeling and when he felt the need to run. And we would just come up with a system to help him to deal with those things. And as I got to know him, I really realized that although he didn't know any of the academic things like his letters, his numbers,
Mhm.
recognizing his name, he really knew a lot in his community. He knew how to go to the store, buy things, support his siblings, and do all the things at home. And so what I began to do is use some of those home skills or the home knowledge that he had and bring it into the classroom to show the class how valuable Ruben really was.
Yeah.
Um, and that changed his way of showing up. He really felt like he then belonged to this group of students in the classroom and then was more open to start to learn what we consider knowledge in schools. And
Mhm.
just became a different classroom for him and a different relationship that he was able to build with his classmates. And so I think it's really important as parents to really start to have conversations with our children about what it means um, to belong and how we can help other people who may not feel like they belong to really be a part of something bigger than who they are.
When you were talking about the story with Ruben, the word that came to my mind was that of ally or allyship. And, you know, in the wake of the murders of Brianna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and certainly George Floyd, we've heard a lot about becoming allies or allyship. And I think you told a very powerful story on the need for that and why that's something we need to be aware of. I think you were going through, I think what you referred to as a boot camp. Could you explain that experience and then maybe talk a little bit about the importance of becoming allies?
Yes, well, the story that I told was my girlfriend and I, and we were the only two Black people in this boot camp. So there was an ex-Marine doing this 8-week boot camp for us and a group of people. And during that 8 weeks, you know, you're working out together every day, sometimes twice a day. We really became like a little family. I mean, it was a really close-knit group. We do stuff outside, you know, have dinner at each other's house, and it was a really great experience.
Hmm.
And the last day of the boot camp, the leader of the boot camp was asking his children to collect all of the equipment. And the daughter jumped up right away, who must have been, you know, maybe 9 or 10 at the time. And she started collecting the things. And the son, who was a couple years younger, he wasn't so enthusiastic about helping to clean up. And he was kind of dragging his feet and moving slowly to kind of help with this head down and not really in the mood to help. And the daughter turned around to her brother and said, "Stop moving like an N." And she said the N word,
Hmm.
and help me. And there was a, you know, obviously complete silence that happened during that moment. Um, and my girlfriend and I, who were the only Black people in the group, saw everybody kind of turn at us. And the point I was making in the book about that is that was a time to have allyship. I mean, it
Hmm.
goes back to that question about raising good people versus pro-justice human beings. And they were all good people. I'd spend time with them. I knew they were good people.
Mhm.
But at that time, nobody stood up for us. We didn't feel like there was any allyship in that. Um, and the lack of a pro-justice person in that moment was very striking for us.
Mhm.
And every time I tell that story, I still feel that feeling that I felt in that time,
Yeah.
feeling almost invisible or not good enough. And so I think it really goes back to this idea of whether we want to raise people who are good people, who
Mhm.
I'm sure they felt badly about it, right? Or people who are pro-justice, who, at that moment, allyship looks like just standing next to me. Allyship may look like putting your hands on my shoulder or squeezing my hand. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that it's something radical. It's just a moment of making people feel like they're not alone.
Mhm. What are some mistakes when people say they want to become allies? You've given us a couple of good pictures there, but what are some mistakes that people make? Let's say they want to ally themselves in some shape or form, but what are some common errors and ways to avoid those errors?
Yeah, I think if we get out of our heads a little bit, right, and move
Mhm.
with our hearts, I think we get so afraid of doing the wrong thing that we do nothing at all.
Mhm.
Um, and I also think one of the issues that come up during allyship is that we want to be supportive of, but we don't want to center ourselves. Like I've had some clients who wanting to do ally work in the Black community
Mhm.
who enter that space saying they know what it feels like to be marginalized or to be hurt because of something else that happened in their lives.
Mhm.
So at that moment, you're not centering your experiences and centering yourself, but that you are moving in a way that you are supportive and standing with or behind the people who are being marginalized. But so I'd say to listen more and talk less, right?
Yeah.
To do what you're asked to do and not take it upon yourself to do what you think is the right thing to do. But I think more than anything, it's about just showing up and being
Mhm.
present and being open into learning.
One of the things that I think was especially valuable about your book is you touch on in great detail the social justice parenting, but there are just plain good parenting lessons there. And a number of times I thought, gee, I wish I'd known this stuff when I was raising my son, who's now in his late 30s. But you bring up some wonderful examples of when you have to talk about or when you need to talk about hard subjects with your children, what the principles are that you believe they should follow. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think a lot of people too are trying to situate my book as more of a political book, and it's really
Mhm.
not. If you really look at the rocks of social justice parenting and what they really stand for, it's about showing up for others who may need help, right? It's
Mhm.
about teaching our kids to self-advocate, to see that there's injustices in the world, and supporting people of whatever identity that is, right? It's not just it's not a race-based book. It's about how do I show up for people who have an identity, a privilege and an identity that I may not have, or in the areas that I have privilege. Like, I mean, I'm Black and I'm a woman, right? Those are usual identities that may not hold as much privilege in the world. But I'm
Mhm.
also upper middle class. I'm a Christian, right? I am cisgendered, I am heterosexual. Those are all areas in which I know I have privilege that I haven't earned.
Mhm.
And so then I have to think about how do I have conversations about to my children about what it is to hold privilege, right? And what it means to use that as a form of support versus as a weapon to divide or separate. And
Mhm.
so, and part of that, those hard conversations have to happen. And as parents, we have to reflect on our own ways of being raised and our own ways of thinking in order to be able to maybe change the way that we show up for our children. So,
Mhm.
for example, I have a lot of clients that I work with that are white moms. And when I ask questions like how often or what were the conversations like that you had with your parents about race, right? About what
Mhm.
it is to be to white in society. And those questions, those conversations are hardly ever happening. But these parents want to be able to have those conversations with their own children so their children are more equipped to deal with what's going on in the world right now. And so those hard subjects are really conversations that really push us as parents, right?
Mhm.
It makes us reflect on our own ways of thinking, our own ways of understanding. perhaps there's some learning, some unlearning, some relearning that has to occur.
Facing what we call the real world, these are very challenging times. And as you establish a social justice home and are really trying to bring these attitudes into your children's lives and to have them express it, and they face these problems, how do you guide them in terms of how to involve themselves in some of the controversies, some of the opposition that we face on, it seems, so many different ranges right now?
Yeah, and I think that's what's getting a lot of parents kind of stuck from moving from raising good people to raising more socially
Mhm.
active kids. And I think the best way to start, is start small, right? Start with the little things, or start with an issue that seems less controversial, right? Something that you're passionate about that
Mhm.
makes it easy for you to kind of get the wheels moving. It could be environmental issues, it could be, issues in education, whatever those are. Start with something small, something that you feel like you can take action in more quickly. And then once you become comfortable with those things, then you're going to add to things that maybe make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. I always
Mhm.
say the work of activism, you're in a constant state of being uncomfortable. And
Mm.
when you become comfortable, right, it means it's time to push yourself a little bit more to get back into that uncomfortable state. But I think also looking at the issues through these three lenses, through the lens of self, right? Self advocacy. How do I teach my kids to advocate for themselves and to be activists for themselves
Mhm.
in situations? And then looking at it through the lens of family. So, how am I modeling this for my children and us doing this in our own household? And then the third lens is through community. Then, how do I take what we're learning at home and then find something in our community that we can kind of tap into as well? And I think, again, starting small, like reading books with our children about, let's say we're talking about racism, reading books about racism, what that looks like at home, what skin color looks like, why skin is different, why people are treated different because of their
Mhm.
skins, starting there. And then moving to maybe writing letters, helping your kids write letters to people in power, maybe to somebody locally in your community, maybe it's your politician. So then now you're thinking outside of yourself. And then the third step could then, let's take that and let's find some anti-racist organizations in our community and see how we can get involved in that area.
What do you teach both your children and others that consult with you when we get engaged in a given cause? It's very easy to suffer burnout from that. And do you have some steps that you suggest to your children or to others to keep, if you will, the well replenished?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of meditation. I'm a big proponent of journaling.
Hmm.
And I also think stepping back uh, is is really mandatory in the work. I think in the work that I do too, I'm an empath. So I really do take on my clients, what's going on in the world. I really take it all in, and I have to find time. And it's not always easy, right? I have guilt around that, taking time off when there's so much
Hmm.
still going on in the world. But I also know that long term self-preservation keeps you in the game longer. And so
Yeah.
I try to tell my kids that it's okay to take an hour off. It's okay to take a day off, because your time off is really with the bigger picture, right? The bigger goal in mind.
Hmm.
Um, so I think teaching meditation, teaching self affirmations, teaching deep breaths, and those kinds of things are really important life skills, really, that we can teach our children.
What do you teach your children or what do you teach others that when they run into somebody who will just not be convinced, who will not see the other side, what attitude do you take? What approach do you take?
Yeah, I know with my kids and with the parents that I work with, I really talk to them about being opening to listening first, right?
Hmm.
Because if you want to tell somebody your values, your perspective, you have to be open to listening to theirs. So being open to listening, and then sharing your perspectives. And when things get, I think, where it's explosive, I think it's also teaching our kids to create boundaries around that as well.
Hmm.
So I think the active listening is really important. And to paraphrase, this is what I hear you saying,
Hmm.
and
Right.
then let me tell you my views on that or my experiences on that. And then hopefully it would engage in a proper dialogue. But if it doesn't, I always say you have permission to use boundaries,
Mhm.
and to be able to excuse yourself from situations that you feel threatened or that you feel are no longer serving you or the person that you're talking to. So I think it's great to teach our kids about kindness and compassion and social activism, but also we have to teach them how to self-preserve, and have boundaries and be able to advocate for themselves in that way as well.
Well, in my opinion, you have made such a difference already. Again, your book, Social Justice Parenting, I highly recommend that. As I say, as a new grandfather, I'm already thinking of ways, and I've talked about it with my wife, in ways that we can utilize some of those principles. Tracy, I thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule and being a part of our program.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all of you watching. We hope that you'll tune in again next week to the next episode of Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.